Last week, the Supreme Court ruled confirming that whilst many powers have been devolved to the UK's nations, the question of whether they should be in the UK has not. Let's take a look at this headline, an article written by our guest here, Liz Saville-Roberts, in the Sunday Times, the Wales edition. Mark Drakeford, must stand up to Sunak and Starmer's denial of democracy. Now, you wrote this article arguing that the United Kingdom is not based on consent. Membership is not voluntary. That was the message to the people of Scotland and Wales after Supreme Court ruling. Should devolved administrations have the right to leave the Union?
Well, it's not based on consent if the means to leave is not there, if the power to do so is not there. I was addressing that question fairly, for good reasons, to the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, because he effectively sits on the fence and says that, that this is based on consent. It's a joint sharing of partnership. It isn't, is it?
Well, Ben, is it or isn't it?
I think it is. We had a referendum. Scotland voted to stay. There you go, job done. I think in terms of, I mean, I'm not aware of any polls in Wales in particular ever requesting independence. It seems to me, I think YouGov consistently says kind of 1 in 4 people wants to have that conversation. So I don't think from a Welsh point of view there's any question about it. Clearly, Scotland is much more contentious, but you know, we have these conversations, we have these elections, and decisions are taken.
Although even in Scotland, it's about a third of Scots who say they want a referendum next year. Just 7% of Scots put Scottish independence in their top 3 issues. So I think it's kind of anti-democratic for Sturgeon to want to impose another referendum when she said in 2014, this is a... I think it would be different if there was a clear Scottish thirst for a referendum, if there was a clear majority of the Scottish public who wanted a referendum and Westminster was saying no. That's a different situation. That is not... What's happening is that Sturgeon is pursuing independence, you know, and this referendum as a political distraction from the massive failings of the SNP in Scotland. You've got NHS waiting lists much higher in Scotland.
They're not here, so we can talk to Liz about Wales. But actually, the central question there being raised by Sonia is why? I mean, has there been a huge surge in people clamouring for an independence referendum?
In Wales, for example, we're looking at about, say, 30–35% support for independence when you take the don't knows out, which is very similar to what was in Scotland prior to the referendum there. And we are talking about independence here on a UK-wide programme, which also is very interesting. Now, for Scotland now, what Nicola Sturgeon was previously proposing, they went into the 2019 general election saying that if you vote for the SNP here, this is a vote in favour of holding another referendum. Both the unionist parties, Labour and Tory, said exactly the opposite. Vote for us and you're voting against a referendum. That returned 49 out of 59 MPs.
But people do not vote on single issues. We know that. There are tons of other things that people vote on. And also you had Sturgeon say, you know, we shouldn't be treating this election in and of itself like an independence referendum. So I think you've got to look at robust surveys of the Scottish public. If it was, you know, 50 to 60% of Scottish people saying we want a referendum next year, I think that's very different. But it is a third of Scots. You know, even
forgive me, this is exactly the same position as the people in Catalonia find themselves too. If you use democratic resources, you run into the wall. The wall that we've run into here is the clarity from the Supreme Court that the devolved governments do not have the power to ask this question. Well, if that is the case, if we have to come back to Westminster to ask for a permission for referendum, when you have, wait for it, out of 650, 533 English MPs, and then we are told that it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity.
But they did give that referendum,
They gave that once.
But interestingly,
want one. Yeah, that once-in-a-generation. Now, what does that mean, then? Because that's what the one that's being thrown at us. Let us just make that comparison. The Good Friday Agreement, the border poll, that's written in once in a generation there. Well, it's not the phrase that is used, but it means every 7 years. 7 years is the gap that has to fall before another border poll can be held. The first piece of legislation that was Wales-specific, back in the end of the 19th century, was to do with a vote to be held in Wales on ceasing to be dry on Sundays. That had it written into it again, for some unknown reason,
All right.
every 7
Well,
years.
hang on, let me let the others...
We're 8 years gone since 2014.
Well, let me let the others in. I mean, who should have the power to decide? I mean, should it be devolved administrations? I mean, if they held a referendum and it didn't win in favour of independence, then that would be that. But should it be a reserved matter to Westminster?
I mean, Liz talks about consent, but Nicola Sturgeon wants to keep asking the same question until she gets the right answer. That is not consent. And as for who should make this decision, the Supreme Court was very clear that this is a matter that affects the whole United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a family.
But why is it different from Northern Ireland? If 7 years is written into legislation there, why is it different to Scotland? Because we have this misaligned nature of the devolved settlement across the United Kingdom.
Does it not say you have to have at least 7 years in between, at least 7 years? It
Yes.
doesn't
It doesn't
decree
say
that you must have a vote every 7
referendum
years.
I don't think anyone voting in 2014 thought, oh, all right, well, we'll just have another go in 7 years. That was a decisive... And
of course, the argument was Brexit hadn't happened,
but as Sonia said, at general elections, people vote on many different issues. At a referendum like that, it was very clear. There was one issue on the paper, and
I think,
independence lost. And I think you talk about the polls for independence in Wales. If you had a referendum, I'm pretty sure you'd lose there as well.
I think... But it would be a really different situation if polls were showing a majority of Welsh
But why not let them decide, Sonia? Why not let Wales decide?
It's well, Wales perhaps, but Scotland, there was a referendum in 2014.
Fair enough.
It's incredibly disruptive to have referendums that dominate the political debate for more than a year, with a gap of 7 years or 10 years, say, and it's not what the Scottish people want.
That's the thing. Is do we know that? I mean, if Wales and Scotland want disruption, if Wales and Scotland want to hold an expensive...
We've had Brexit imposed.
Only 7% of Scots say independence is in their top
Let me
priorities.
ask a different question, is, in terms of it being a reserved power, what is the mechanism for Scotland and Wales to actually get a referendum?
Well, we govern by consent, don't we, at the end of the day? So I think it's absolutely right to say
there
that...
isn't one.
But to say that if the polling was genuinely suggesting that it was something that was necessary and
Westminster
wanted, then Westminster wouldn't be able to say no, but it isn't. And particularly in Wales, I mean, it's less than 1 in 4 people.
OK, so you'll
in
go for the
Wales.
polling, but you won't go for a referendum? Where's the rationale? That's not democratic.
There has to be a legitimate reason to
hold
have
a referendum.
because
is
of
a huge
the cost, the disruption, the challenge of all of that.
OK, but then, again, forgive me, I'm being devil's advocate, but I can't overemphasise this. Why is 7 years for one of the 4 constituent nations of the UK an already accepted legal interpretation?
Not an idea that you must have one every 7 years.
But
There isn't a
nonetheless, that figure
referendum
is extant there, whereas what we're told for Scotland is once in a generation without a definition of what a generation is. Now, it allows people like Nicola Sturgeon and me to say that these nations are being held against their will by the tyranny of the majority.
Are they, though? That's the question.
The courts have said...
I don't think people buy that.
No,
I just
the
don't.
courts have said that this is a national matter that must be decided by law in the UK in Westminster. So if you want to change it so that there is a different system, we need to have the debate in that place.
And we need to get the consent of
Well, look, there's one thing we
533
can't...
English MPs.
I mean, I do think the big difference...
Hang on. Sorry, I was going to say, go on, final thought before we move on to something that we all agree on, which is the importance of the football tonight.
Excellent. Well, I was just going to say, I think in Catalonia, Madrid got itself into massive trouble because there was clearly a popular mandate for a referendum. I don't think it would ever be credible. I think if there were a majority of people in Scotland who are saying in polls, we want a referendum, I think Westminster has to grant it. I would support that.
I think also you talk about who gets to decide. Well, in the Scottish referendum, Scots who lived in England had no say. English people had no say over the integrity of their own country. So I think this is rightly a matter for the whole of the United Kingdom as a family.
It's time to talk about football, my favourite subject at the
Will we
moment.
all agree?
For the first time, England